This week on the Men at the Movies podcast, we conclude our Lord of the Rings series with the Return of the King. We discuss how this story sets a vision for who we could be as men. Through testing and pain, growth is possible and our true selves are revealed. And for all the armies, politics, strength, and wisdom, the fate of the world depends on the small battle for your heart. Join us as we discover our stories in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being. Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me for it's not really a cleanup because it's not the fourth installment, but batting cleanup for this third installment, the final installment of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is Jay Heck. Hey man, how you doing?
Man, I'm pumped. This is the greatest of the movies, I think. I'm stoked.
And I think in a lot of ways, everybody talks about the importance of trilogies. You know, we see the Matrix trilogy or the Star Wars trilogies. And, you know, this was obviously started as a book, and hazarding a guess here, it's the trilogy, kind of especially the final installment that every other one is compared to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
We are going to do our best to navigate this because, as Jay mentioned, there is a lot, not just in this movie, the Lord of the Rings or the Return of the King movie specifically. And we are only dealing with the theatrical cut, where we didn't do the extended version because I didn't have 4.5 hours. But there is a lot of content, both in this movie, but as a whole. So as we wrap up this series and this trilogy, we wanted to sort of go back and ask some of the bigger thematic questions of the story in itself. And that's really what we talk about when we talk about movies or books. It's really story. Mm-hmm. So why, Jay, do you think that this is one of the greatest stories of all time?
Well, you know, in your introduction, with the music in the background, you talk about the stories that we love being reflections of a larger story, of another story. And and like all things, like I model my parenting as best I can after what I see other really good parents doing. You know, the best that I can do. And it's a great gift to have a vision of people who do things well so that I can try and emulate it. And I think of all the movies that I love movies. I love storytelling because it speaks even at a deeper level than, like Paul's epistles or somebody who just going and reading out of a book. This is how you should live. These are the 10 rules to living. When I see it in a story, there's something that I am able to embrace more deeply about that truth, and I'm able to carry that and remember it more. And in the Lord of the Rings, you're not only getting a snapshot through multiple characters of what initiation looks like to go from being a boy to being a man, which you could take any number of other stories and that's the story, and that's enough for you to resonate with it. But this one's actually going on this incredibly large scale, so large that it's bigger than, it's bigger than anything that we can see.
Yeah.
It actually challenges, like I was telling you last week, like when I introduced my father to this, he couldn't get into it. He loves World War II movies. He loves the Civil War. He loves the scale and the scope of that. But there's something about this movie that is so epic in nature. It's a blending of humanity and a supernatural realm that actually challenges what we believe may or may not be behind the physical human powers that we see. There's a lot. I've done a lot of studies, and I love reading about World War II, like my dad does.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't know what were the powers that manifested Hitler and Mussolini, to move forward. And I think in a story like this, we actually see the supernatural powers that are behind it, which begs us to ask the question: are there things going on in my story and in the world that we're living in that I don't understand? What is that story? And where am I in that story? And what will be my response to that story? So there's an invitation to look deep,
mm-hmm.
deeper than what we can see, that this story presents. And I would hate to stand before God one day and have him say, look, I gave you the Lord of the Rings as a blueprint.
Right.
To have you challenge why this story or what animates the human powers that are visible, and you didn't take the bait. You didn't think about it. And I think that's it. I mean, this is really a battle about a kingdom over the course of the kingdom's story that has an enemy that is working strategically in darkness over time, and then eventually comes out in a very mocking way once he's built enough power, and he begins intimidating. And I think that's every enemy's story, is that while he's planning, he stays in darkness. But then at some point, when men lower their guard, and their defenses, which is what's happened over the course of this story, is that evil comes up and it prevails and it mocks, and you can even see the increasing darkness throughout the stories. And then the big question: what will man do now that first they see the story more clearly? Second, they realize that they have a decision to make
mm-hmm.
as to what role they're going to play in it. And then thirdly, they have to have the courage to enter into it. They have to do it. And overall, I think there's two lines in this movie that repeat themselves, and I think it really is the ultimate purpose of the movie, is given the story that you're in, how will your quality be proved? That was said of Faramir multiple times. And in this last version, Gandalf is looking at Pippin, who just keeps messing up and keeps proving his kind of stupidity. And Gandalf says to him, here's a great time for one of the Shire folk to once again prove their worth. And so there's that phrase again. Every man is given the opportunity with his life to prove his worth. And that's what you see through all the beautiful character arcs in this great story. I think that's why it's one of the greatest movies of all time here.
I love that every man wants to prove their worth.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that, and you mentioned that what would we do when faced with evil? Because in this story, especially early on, and it started a little bit in the last one, it said the two towers, but that was talking about sort of the two towers of evil.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the Fellowship of the Ring, we had our slow orientation of who are the people, what's going on, what's our role to play. And even so, as we talked about, Merry and Pippin sign up and they're like, we want to go, though Frodo, I'll take the ring, though I don't know the way. Pippin and Merry, they want to go for friendship and to prove their worth to Frodo. And so that's the slow orientation, as we talked about before we started recording. Chapter 2 in the book 2, the Two Towers, was, there's evil. You had Saruman and Sauron. And you get to the point at the end of the movies where this sense of resistance is futile, right? You pulled a line from Theoden that we cannot defeat the armies of Mordor, but we will face them in battle nonetheless. Because we do get faced with that question when we face evil, what would we do? You can do, and we were contrasting Denethor and Theoden. Denethor gave up. He became a slave to his small story. Although he was a steward of Gondor, entrusted with taking care of that kingdom, that smaller kingdom, until the king returns, he said, no, this is my kingdom, and I will not allow anyone to come take the throne from me, basically. Whereas Theoden had the wool pulled over his eyes by Wormtongue and Saruman. But when he remembered who he was, he remembered his identity, he cared for his people. They went to Helm's Deep to try to protect them. And even though he had a bit of a moment here in this movie where he said, if Gondor calls for aid, why would we answer? They haven't helped us. But when the beacon fires were lit, he did respond. And that's when he said that we're not going to be victorious, but we're going to face them nonetheless. And you have those two pictures of our response. One is a man who's stuck in his smaller story of life is about what I can manage and what I can create, control, manipulate, and ultimately leads in death for Denethor. Or life is about something bigger than me and my petty offenses, because he is able to set that aside and goes off to war and knows, and he ends up dying in the battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my favorite lines really is Theoden. I have a deep affection for Theoden because he's released from darkness, and I really identify with that as a man who did not know God or Christ and didn't care at one point. Somebody came along, and I can picture people in my life who came and they rescued me and they invited me back into the story. And yet I made a lot of mistakes. And one of my big mistakes is doing it on my own, trying to do life on my own.
Yeah.
And you see that with Theoden at Helm's Deep. He refuses out of pride to call on anybody. He refuses to call on the neighboring human kingdom, Gondor, to come and help. And he scorns the elves. He's like, I'm going to do it all on my own. But victory did not come without somebody coming to his rescue. And I think it took him a while to realize that. And so when Gondor comes for help, or when he knew that Gondor needed them, he said, why should I go and help them? But then in time to reflect on the mistake that he made at Helm's Deep, I think he's able to see, okay, wait a minute. Like, I want my honor preserved as a man, which means that when there's the need to be called upon, I'm going to go and I'm going to meet that need. And one of my absolute favorite, to see the whole story aggregated and his honor being restored in the very last line of his life as he's crushed under the weight of the horse in a battle that he so brilliantly led the charge in for the Rohirrim. He says, now, Eowyn, you have to let me go. My body is broken, and I go now to my fathers, in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed. That is one of the lines that makes me cry.
Yeah.
Because I do not want to be ashamed. That is probably my greatest fear, is that when I cross over, I will stand before one who looks at me and says, what have you done with your life? And to know that I have given myself over in the way that I was intended by God to give my life over. That's huge. Huge.
Yeah.
You have the absolute opposite, of course, like you said with Denethor, the absolute opposite.
Yeah.
In every way.
Yeah. And again, Denethor is a fascinating and many ways repulsive character.
Mm-hmm.
The way that he sort of lifted up and idolized his son Boromir, who ended up being the weak one who could not withstand the ring, right. Diminished Faramir, who was, as we talked about last time, one of my favorite characters, because he was able to stand firm in the day of temptation and say, no, take the ring and go on. But there's this, we keep talking about the larger story, right? The good versus evil story. And even going back to the first one, and Frodo's like, I wish this ring had never come to me. Yeah, we tend to do those things. And he says, I'm just a hobbit. I can't save Middle Earth. I just want to help my friends with Merry and Pippin. That's their sentiment. And with Sam, it was not about the ring. It was Frodo and his love for Frodo that kept him going. But for Frodo, it was the burden, and it was just his job to do. He didn't know the way. So he's going, and I think our tendency as men, and we see it in Denethor, and it took him to evil places. And we see it with Frodo as they're climbing the stairs, and there's this whispering in his ear as Smeagol is telling him. And for me, it's a glimpse into how evil works in our lives, not just to start off diminishing our role of, I'm just a hobbit. I'm just a guy in Texas or North Carolina. What can I do? But also to then say, what you are trying to do, somebody else is trying to take it.
Master carries heavy burden. Smeagol knows heavy burden. That one cannot know. Smeagol look after Master. He wants it. He needs it. Smeagol sees it in his eye. Very soon, he will ask you for it. You will see. The Fat One will take it from you.
There's just enough truth in there, right? You carry a heavy burden. And we talked about last time how Frodo saw in Smeagol / Gollum the fear of who he might become. And I think that voice in our heads, because that's the only way I can describe it, the voice in our heads that whispers those things, it says, they don't know what it's like. They're going to try to take what's precious, and you have to guard it. You have to keep it from their hands. And what that does is it divides Frodo from the person who can help him and who loves him the most in this story, at least the most intimately, because Gandalf obviously has great affection for him as well. But it divides him and isolates him through lies, to the point where Frodo no longer trusts the voice of his closest companion. And I think that we, as men, we face those crossroads many times where we get to this point, and this the other clip I have that's sort of almost the next scene with them, of the diminishment of Gollum's voice getting louder to the point where Frodo no longer trusts Sam and severs their friendship.
Here, just rest a bit.
I'm all right.
No, you're not all right. You're exhausted. It's that Gollum. It's this place. It's that thing around your neck. I could help a bit. I could carry it for a while. I could carry it. Share the load. Get away! I don't want to keep it. I just want to help.
See, he wants it for himself.
Shut up, you! Go away! Get out of here!
No, Sam. It's you. I'm sorry, Sam.
But he's a liar. He's poisoned you against me.
You can't help me anymore.
You don't mean that.
Go home.
With all the royalty, right? We've talked about Denethor, the steward of Gondor, and Theoden, the king of Rohan. And even Aragorn shows up with all their might, with all the men under their command, with all the power that they have to wield. the fate of the world comes down to this struggle for Frodo's heart between Gollum and Sam. And in this moment, Frodo takes the wrong path. He listens to the voice of the liar. And we've all done that.
Yeah. This strikes me. This is another one of those points in the film that makes me so frustrated, even to the point of tears, or at least, the first 5 or 6 times I watched the movie. But it still chokes me up. I can identify with there being an accuser that is separating me from the one who is actually meant to lighten my load. Not take my load from me, but teach me and help me carry it.
Yeah.
This is Matthew 11. Jesus didn't say, I'll take your burdens from you. He said, basically, share them with me and your load will be light and easy. And nobody loves Frodo like Sam. Nobody.
No. Yeah.
And, we were talking last time about just the difference in voices between invitation and accusation and how you can recognize who's speaking to you through which of those, it really boils down to. And yeah, I just know that I cannot carry the weight personally. Jay Heck, can I carry the weight of the task that God has entrusted to my care without his intimate help? And yet the big tension is whether I believe he's taking my life from me or whether he's preserving my life by his intimate fellowship with me on this trip, in this short life. And I think that's the battle that you're seeing here on those cliffs.
And that's the one that matters. It's this for all the armies and all the thousands of people who are, sort of on the battle lines. It comes down to these 3 individuals between Gollum and Sam and Frodo.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the other repeating theme of this series is victory is not won through strength. It's not won through great wisdom. And it's won through the heart. Sam's following Frodo because he loves him. Merry and Pippin follow them because he's their friend and they want to do whatever they can. Or at least, believe they would, right? Something along those lines. They want to put themselves in position to be available. And it does. It comes down to the battle for Frodo's heart. And, obviously he goes in and realizes his big mistake. But I believe we think as men, what does this bigger story have to do with me? We're not Billy Graham out doing evangelization and, out in stadiums and seeing hundreds of people come to Christ. We might not go to the mission field and live our lives out in Chad or in the jungles of Indonesia or something like that. We're sort of just, like the hobbits, just sort of hoping for another meal and maybe a beer and a smoke and to sit in our comfy hobbit holes. How can we change the world? How can we manage to do anything? Great. I think even Aragorn faces this a bit. And Elrond shows up as they're gathering, and he brings the sword. Remember, we had talked earlier about the shards of Narsil, the sword that Elendil used to cut the ring off of Sauron's hand. And he shows up, he had reforged the sword. And he shows up because Aragorn is still not the king. He still hasn't become who he was meant to be. And I think that's also us. Frodo is dealing with the conflicting voices. And typically the one we're supposed to listen to isn't the one screaming in our ear. It'd be nice if it sounded all evilly like Smeagol and Gollum did. I mean, it's like you hear it, you're like, oh, I know what the bad guy's voice is. But it tends to not sound like that. But it ends up Aragorn gets an invitation. And it's sort of an invitation and a gift. And again, very similar to Frodo. It's not something he necessarily wants to do or feels right to do, but it's something he kind of has to do.
The shadow is upon us, Aragorn. The end has come.
It will not be our end, but his.
You ride to war, but not to victory.
Sauron's armies march on Minas Tirith, this you know, but in secret he sends another force which will attack from the river. A fleet of corsair ships sails from the south. They'll be in the city in 2 days. You're outnumbered, Aragorn. You need more men.
There are none.
There are those who dwell in the mountain.
Murderers. Traitors. You would call upon them to fight. They believe in nothing. They answer to no one.
They will answer to the King of Gondor.
Anduril, flame of the west, forged from the shards of Narsil. Sauron will not have forgotten the sword of Elendil. The blade that was broken shall return to Minas Tirith.
The man who can wield the power of this sword can summon to him an army more deadly than any that walks this earth. Put aside the ranger. Become who you are born to be.
I love that line.
Mm-hmm.
Put aside the ranger. Become who you were born to be. If I was Aragorn, I've got to think, okay, but as we know, going back to the first one, he has doubts. Is he the man who does have the strength to wield that sword? What happens if he walks the paths of the dead and those guys don't recognize his authority as king? It's this, again, the battle for his heart. Who is he going to be? Because he can't be both. He can't be both ranger and king. Just like Frodo had to make a choice. It can't be both Gollum and Sam. He had to pick one. And I think we face those same choices daily.
Yeah. Aragorn had a bit of an advantage over many men these days. And like he had something that Pippin and some of the Hobbit folk did not have. He knew from the beginning that the role of king was his to take. And the weight of it is what prevented him from stepping forward into it. He knew what it would cost him, and he was afraid of letting people down. It was his character that made him wrestle with it. You've got other characters in the movie that have no idea what they're being swept up into, and they've never been told you were born for greatness at all. And so they actually have to have a vision painted to them over time so that they can choose to be that. And many times the vision is simply, well, what kind of man do I want to be? One who cowered and did not enter into battle, or one who entered into battle? They don't see themselves as a great king. And I think many of us wrestle with, well, I don't think that I'm born to do anything really great. And maybe we won't know what that is. I think that's part of God's plan for us, is that we're just designed to trust and to become more than we are right now. And then in the end, he reveals to us what role it is that we actually played. But, John Eldridge has asked a question that has both haunted and guided me for almost a decade now. What kind of man do you want to be? It's that simple. Do you want to be courageous, or do you want to be a coward? Do you want to be a good husband who actually fulfills your vows to this woman that you made, or one who compromises? Do you want to always engage in battle, or do you want to be the guy who's sitting on the couch drinking your beer because you just don't have the strength or the courage or the will? It's like every day, every moment, in every environment that we walk into, we're faced with a question: what kind of man do I want to be? I think very few of us have any idea, like Aragorn did, like what we're actually being invited into. Which is part of the power of the new name. And I think many of us could get a vision, at least a little vision of that, if we simply ask God, well, how do you see me?
Yes.
And it would be such a tremendous reorientation if we could catch a glimpse of that. And he only gives to us what we can handle at a time. Right. I think of the Israelites in the promised land. I've called you to live in the promised land, and you're going to change the rest of the world. And through you, I will take back all the nations. They had no idea what that looked like. They had never seen the promised land before, but there was just a little taste, and here's where we're going, and you'll just trust me. And I think, yeah.
And even during that, they went the long way because, and it even says, because they were not ready for the battle.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think many of us fall to the temptation of, we feel this calling, we see this calling or this vision, and we pursue it. We chase it. But, as it says in Zorro, we would have fought bravely and died quickly. And it's interesting as we've talked so much about vision, and in Proverbs 29, it says, without vision, where there is no vision, the people perish. Going back to our opening question, why do we love this? Because it establishes a vision of who we could be as men. Nobody wants to be Boromir, right? In the story.
Right.
And who is it that you want to be? And then, like you mentioned, those daily choices of, how am I going to fight for the heart of my wife, for my children's, for my own heart? What am I going to do to prepare myself for the battle that will come? Because as you mentioned, Aragorn did have a vision. He had, not all of us have a poem, but I think that it's a powerful statement of who we are, who we want to be as men. And the poem is, all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be the blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king.
That's a description of every believer in the kingdom of God from God's perspective. That's a picture of Jesus, and then all of us, in as parts of him. That's our story right there. Yeah. That's what every man wants. But there is a journey to get it, for sure. Another thing that really struck me is in my part of my calling, first and foremost, is to become what God created me to be. And I've received some visions in my life, some of these foggy pictures that were attractive enough for me to, continue moving in that direction, even through opposition. But, part of what my joy is in life is inviting other men to realize how God sees them, and to realize our identity as sons, and to see the process by which God turns a boy into a man. He turns a little hobbit gardener into a warrior who can come back and defend his keep. I think that's what all of us are made to do. Years ago, I read a book by Richard Rohr who outlined 5 truths that every boy must accept to become a man I mean, a really good man in its fullest sense. And this movie, I mean, over the course of the story, these truths are so in your face, and you get to see who accepts these truths and who doesn't, and you get to see the fruit of it. And I mean, these truths are, life is hard. You start in the Shire where they don't want, it's all peaches and cream, right? but life is hard. How will you deal with that reality? Number 2, you are not that important. Like when I hear Faramir finally understand his place in the story and how important it is that he lets Frodo go, and he says, then my life is forfeit. Mm-hmm. He accepts that his life is really not that important in the larger story. It's not about you. And you see all these people coming to the conclusion that really my life is really about allowing others to live. It's not about me. It's about those who come after me. The 4th truth, you're not in control. To hear Theoden say, how did it come to this? To hear Frodo lament, I wish the ring had never come to me. To realize at some point in our lives that we are not in control. And it's what Gandalf says. First, you have to just accept that. And then all you have to do is choose what you will do with the days that are given to you. And then the last one is that you're going to die. That's the 5th powerful reality. So how then will you die? Will you do it like Theoden? Will you do it like Aragorn? In your willingness to do that? And if you can come to grips with those realities and then stand on top of those difficult truths and say, this then is the man that I choose to be, then you will be a different person to everyone that you know, to your children, to your family, everywhere. I just love how in your face these are in this movie.
Well, and they actually talk about that 5th one. There's a conversation as Gandalf and Pippin are about to face off the enemy, and from everything that it looks, Minas Tirith is about to be taken over. And Pippin says, basically, I'm scared.
I didn't think it would end this way.
End? No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path. One that we all must take. The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it.
What? Gandalf? See what?
White shores. And beyond. A far green country. Under a swift sunrise.
That isn't so bad.
No. No, it isn't.
Because there's worse things than death. And I think that the reason that we do this sort of thing, Jay, is because we've seen men who have already died, but they're still walking around without a heart, or have it diminished or discounted or discarded. And they're just trying to make life work. They're trying to find, scratch out a little something in this life, but who are also scared to death of death, who try to protect and sort of set up boundaries and controls and try to just, they're living that small story. That whole idea of the center cannot hold. If you're the center of your world, then it's going to fall apart.
And then, Paul, there's the other kind of man who has died to trying to hold his life together. He's died to his will to make life easy and all about him, and to stay in control and to refuse the reality of death. He is there's a famous line from, I don't know how famous it is, but it's the line that sticks out the most from the HBO series Band of Brothers, where one of the one of the sergeants, I believe, comes to one of the terrified soldiers and he says, the secret is it's really easy being a good soldier. You just have to realize that you're already dead.
Yeah.
and then you can fight as you were meant to. It's the only way that you can actually do your duty.
Well, and that's true because in the battle, if you're the one who's coward, I think of the Saving Private Ryan and was it Upham who couldn't he couldn't turn the corner and save his buddy's life because he was so afraid of dying. And in that moment, a piece of him died.
Yeah.
And it's the ones who are most afraid of dying that end up actually dying because they don't fight with ferocity, with heart, with full of love for all that is behind is the quote that's been coming up recently is we don't fight because of hatred for what's in front of us, but for love of what's behind us.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's very little that you can expect from a man whose story is really about him.
And you brought up a contrast between Lord of the Rings and Fight Club.
Right. Yes.
Which is another movie on our list. Maybe we'll get you to come back for that one.
Well, see, I am not a fan of that movie. I had somebody tell me to go and watch it.
Right.
And I trusted this guy and I went and I watched it and I'm glad for, the sake of the landscape that we live in today to have seen it so that when I'm watching a movie like The Lord of the Rings, you can see this contrast. Both of these movies wildly popular in pop culture. But why? Why? An enormous difference. I want to read, I actually host once a month of campfire or at my house and I call it Fight Club. And every once in a while I will read this little monologue that Tyler Durden, I think is the name of the guy. It's his famous line. Basically, it's a story about all these white collar and blue collar workers that are just so pissed off about life that they meet in these secret locations and they beat the crap out of each other. And it is the richest source of life that they have. And as they're doing this, they're actually they're finding confidence and strength that they otherwise wouldn't. Okay, what a contrast. I want to read to you this quote from Tyler Durden, and this is it. This is straight from the movie. This is the Brad Pitt character who's got, a broken tooth and still soap and's got tattoos. So he's speaking to the guys who are beating the crap out of each other, and he says this, "Man, I see in Fight Club the strongest and smartest men who've ever lived. I see all this potential I see squandering, God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off." So that is a movie that's wildly popular because many in the culture the men say, that's how I feel.
Yeah.
Why the hell am I alive right now? And that's enough to bring a man to do what these guys were doing in basements. They're initiating themselves because nobody else had initiated them because they have no good story to live in. And then you contrast that with The Lord of the Rings, which millions flock to and are inspired by, where you now find these small characters who are living in these small stories, but in contrast, they're invited up into something much, much larger than themselves. They're finding their courage. They're finding their place in a much larger story. And that's the rescue. So the big question for all of humanity and anybody who's listening to this is, we have to be living in a larger story that we're not seeing. That's what all these movies are telling us. There's a story that you can't see. will you be curious enough to search it out? Because that will actually be your rescue. And if it's a story that's so small that leaves you to initiate yourselves, look at what the product of that is in our culture. Like, uninitiated boys will initiate themselves, and they will, I can't remember the quote who said it, they will literally burn down the culture just to feel the warmth of the fire, because nobody else has invited them around a larger fire to participate in their place in the tribe. And everybody in this story, the Lord of the Rings that we're talking about, everybody ends up having that vision revealed to them as the story that they're living in, and they're invited to take their place. Whether they do it or not depends on how well they face all those fears and that reality. But that's why Fight Club does nothing for me except depress me about the culture that we live in. And it makes it important to me as a man to help others understand the story that we're living in, because I realize to understand your story is a far bigger rescue than we know. And what if God's actually the one writing and producing these movies? Which, how many of those do you see these days now? Almost nothing. Yeah. There's almost no great stories like this anymore. The Marvel comics, they actually depress me. They piss me off. They're a bunch of superheroes that don't have to deal with their mortality. Their world is all about them. So you've got superheroes that are not dealing with these 5 truths. Unlike the Lord of the Rings, they're all like us.
Well, and unlike, too, the Band of Brothers. Those are guys, again, I love, this idea of the self-initiation, because you do see that in today's society and culture. And, we think we're supposed to be, everything's up and to the right, growth and profit. All, that's a sign of God's blessing.
Yeah.
But sometimes God's blessing is like, for instance, I think of Frodo. He gets to the end. He gets to the brink. And Sam says, "What are you waiting for? Just let it go." But he can't, because it feels like death to him. Mm-hmm. And it takes Gollum jumping on him, biting off his finger, and celebrating for Frodo to be free. Because sometimes our rescue is losing a job. Mm-hmm. And on it, that's part of my story. I was a manager and a leader, and they said, you don't have to necessarily go home, but you can't stay here. And, for something that I poured my heart into for 2 or 3 years, and then I realized that's not a really long time, but that was something I cared about. And to say, no, you need to do something else. Well, I was lost, but that was one of the catalysts that ended up with me showing up back in church. So, and sometimes the best things that can happen are the job loss, are the tragedies, and we're, I don't understand how God's sovereignty works. This is not that kind of podcast. But God uses our pain, or we don't want to waste our pain. We want to learn from it. We want to grow from it. We want to be matured by it and not just be taken out by it.
Yeah. I mean, if we're wise.
Yeah. Well, that's what, and John Maxwell, I think, talks about that of experience isn't the great teacher. It's learning from your experience that makes you develop and grow.
Mm-hmm. Evil is really powerful. I mean, in opposition, I think of like who we would be if we came into the world and didn't experience pain. All great growth comes from pain.
Yeah.
All growth comes from pain. We define happiness by pain. That's another one of the lines from The Matrix, actually, is they originally built the Matrix with no pain, and it completely fell apart because a human's life is defined by pain. Joy and pain are intermingled, and so we recreated the program with pain in it, and it works.
This feels right. It's funny. A buddy of mine sent me a video last night or this morning, I think, talking about lobsters, and that the only way as the lobster grows inside the shell, there comes a point where the shell doesn't fit. It's too tight and the shell doesn't grow. So in order for the lobster to continue to grow, he hides under a rock, sheds the shell, and regrows a new one that fits. But if he doesn't listen to the pain, and this is what this, I don't even know where the video came from, but this old dude with this long white beard. And he said, if we don't honor the pain and we just go and say, hey, I need some Valium, I need some Percocet, I need some alcohol or whatever, we numb the pain, then we don't ever grow. And we end up dying because we're so compressed inside a shell that doesn't fit.
So true. And I mean, going back to the Lord of the Rings, isn't that what you see at the end? I mean, the reason that I can tear up as I look at the last hero shot of each of these members is because I've seen them take that journey. I've seen them time and time again molt out of their old small shell into something larger, even when they didn't want it.
Yeah.
You know, and it makes me find perspective and courage to face my own fears. This movie literally helps me to live better. I've got gray hair. I want to be Theoden. And I want to be Aragorn, of course. I'm a young man with many years ahead, so I want to be Aragorn, but I've got many years behind. I want to be Theoden as well. It helps me parent as well. I don't want my kids living in the Shire. I don't want to create a Shire for them. They need to see the larger story to really enjoy the Shire.
Right.
And they need to see what protected it, you know? Yeah.
And that's one of those scenes that tears me up, chokes me up. There's many in this one. But when the four hobbits get back to the Shire and they're recounting, and it's like, it's been 13 months. All this happened in a year, basically. And they go and the Shire looks generally the same. The same people are there. The same things are going on. They're going to the little bars and hanging outside their hobbit holes, and they sit down and have a beer and just give each other that look of we've been through life. We've been through battles. Our hearts have been tested, and we've been through, you know, as Paul says, I've been through my initiation. So to wrap up, in this movie, as we mentioned, the identity comes out. Through testing, we are revealed who we are. Through our initiation, we are revealed who we are. And the vision, as you mentioned, you set the vision for your children. You have to give them some direction of, this is the truth about the world. This is how I prepare you for the world. As we've been talking throughout this whole episode, the vision is important. And what vision do you have for your life? Because that's where it starts. Because if you don't have a vision, then you can't have a vision for your family or your work or your relationships or anything.
And Paul, it's important to note that you can't come up with your own vision for yourself.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when you know, that scripture you referred to, I believe is actually in Proverbs twice because of its importance. Without a vision, and actually if you look that word up in the Hebrew, it's without a divinely given revelation. Like, God has to reveal to you who you are, the story that you're living in, what you are made for, what the masculine heart is designed to do, how you are to bear the image of God. These are things that you can't just come up with on your own. That's actually what we see in the world everywhere, is people coming up with their own vision and saying, I reject your vision. You have to allow me to have my own vision. That's fine. Okay. But it's going to fall apart.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and that was the contrast we saw with the Fight Club, is they were establishing their own vision and then taking out their frustration because they can't achieve it on their own. And we can't achieve our vision on our own. I mean, otherwise it's just kind of what we want. It's not really a vision.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reality is that God's vision will be really hard to accept because it's way bigger than anything that you would try and bite off on your own. And it will feel impossible. The more clarity that you get, the more you realize, in order for me to do that, to become that, I can't do it on my own. It will actually require supernatural assistance, which is exactly the point.
Yeah.
It's the reason we're alive. It's to do something with God that's impossible if we try and do life without him.
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up. Unless you have anything else to add.
No, I mean, there's just so much. You can see a picture of the coming kingdom in that ceremony, at the top of, on the big white tower of Icthalion, when the new king is coronated. You see the rightful king, the healer, honoring all those who have fought with him. He was willing to give his life time and time and time again for his people. And you see him setting things right. And even his line reflects so much the promise of the coming kingdom with Jesus at the helm again, where he says, now it is time for us to rebuild this world, which is what we get to do.
Yeah.
Someday.
Yeah.
It's very exciting.
Jay, thanks for putting in the hours and the effort and time to dig into this movie. And I appreciate it because, one, I got to know you a little better, but the other is I got to re-engage with this story that, like, I still have the books I think my parents gave me when I was like 10, maybe 13. I normally they signed it, so I'd have to look. I've had the hardcover books for decades, and to get to go back in them and look at the books, relive this story. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, these are a gift. These stories are a gift to the human soul, for sure. Well, I've had a great time, Paul. Thank you so much for helping me think more deeply to understand why I love them so much. It's really been good.
Yeah,
for me.
And maybe we'll get your dad converted one day.
Maybe. Yeah, I may have to sit down and explain to him at least what I see.
Although he finds his initiation in what stirs his heart is in World War II stuff, which is still
Absolutely.
Pretty good. I mean, that Band of Brothers that's also on the list of things we want to do up here. So.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
So this has been Paul McDonald and Jay Heck talking about not just Return of the King, but the whole series, The Lord of the Rings. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to dig a little deeper, we have some resources available on our website, menatthemovies.com/podcast, where you can see some quotes. We'll put some links into some resources and stuff that we've talked about, as well as if you wanted to get together with a couple guys, watch the movie, there's questions that you could ask. And even if it's not with a couple guys, just watch the movie and look at our questions and see where God is leading you. So I hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Farewell, my brave hobbits. My work is now finished. Here at last, on the shores of the sea, comes the end of our fellowship. I will not say do not weep. Not all tears are evil.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?